In this lesson, we're going to go over our case brief for Pennoyer v. Neff. This is a United States Supreme Court decision from 1877. If you want to follow along with me as I work through this case brief, simply visit studicata.com/case-briefs. And from there, you can just search Pennoyer v. Neff. Case is going to pop up. Just click on that. You'll be good to go if you'd like to follow along with me as I work through this case brief. So just for some quick background before we jump into the facts here of Penoyer, this case centers on personal jurisdiction. So for this case, we want to understand personal jurisdiction at a broad level before we just jump into it. This is really going to help us understand the court's decision in Pennoyer v. Neff. So personal jurisdiction, specifically in personam jurisdiction, is all about whether the court has the authority to adjudicate the rights and liabilities of the defendant. It ensures we have some connection between the defendant and the forum state. Remember, the plaintiff gets to choose the forum. Plaintiff can go and file his action anywhere he wants. He can go to Alabama, New York, California, doesn't matter, right? Plaintiff gets to choose where to file the action. And wherever the plaintiff files it, whatever state that court sits in, we call that state the forum state. So we can think of this as the plaintiff selecting the forum. Personal jurisdiction just says, hey, look, there has to be a sufficient connection between the defendant and the forum state selected by the plaintiff. Think about it. Otherwise, if you're a plaintiff and you're suing a defendant, if we don't have the personal jurisdiction requirement, basically the plaintiff could just go over to the map of the United States and say, what state gives me the best possible outcome for this litigation, right? What state is the best possible place for me to file this thing, right? And the plaintiff could just choose any state they wanted. And the defendant would have no recourse. Defendant would just have to show up and litigate wherever the plaintiff chooses. Personal jurisdiction is a due process right the defendant enjoys. It allows the defendant to challenge jurisdiction and say, hey, look, I don't have a connection to this forum. I shouldn't be sued here. This court doesn't have the authority to adjudicate my rights and liabilities because I don't have any connection to this state, right? And basically they can challenge jurisdiction. And if they win on that challenge, the plaintiff will have to file his action in a forum where there is a sufficient connection to the defendant, okay? So that's how personal jurisdiction, specifically in personam jurisdiction, works from a really big picture perspective. Essentially, in all of our personal jurisdiction cases that we read in law school, essentially what we're getting at is the question of, okay, well, we understand we need a sufficient connection between the defendant and the forum state. Well, when is a connection sufficient? That is what Pennoyer v. Neff is exploring. That's what all of your cases in personal jurisdiction will essentially be exploring. When is that connection sufficient? And we see, to give it away in Pennoyer v. Neff, the Supreme Court in 1877 takes a very limited approach. They basically say, look, for this connection to be sufficient between the defendant and the forum state, the defendant has to establish some sort of physical presence in the forum state. Basically, either the defendant lives in the forum state, defendant consents to jurisdiction in the forum state, or the defendant is served while physically present in the forum state. But in any event, the defendant has to have some sort of physical presence in the forum state. Like, that's what's going to be required in 1877 under Pennoyer v. Neff, basically for that connection between the defendant and the forum to be sufficient. Of course, after Pennoyer v. Neff, specifically when we get to International Shoe v. Washington in 1945, we see this idea is greatly expanded, right? The idea of a connection being sufficient is greatly expanded from the limitations of Pennoyer v. Neff. And at the end of this, I can kind of come back, though, and show where Pennoyer v. Neff fits in, where International Shoe fits in, kind of how the whole thing works. But I think the next best step is we can just get into the facts here. And at the end, we can wrap it up and show kind of how it all fits together in basically today's jurisprudence of in personam jurisdiction. Okay, so let's just get into the facts of Pennoyer v. Neff. Okay, Pennoyer v. Neff is a landmark case arising from a dispute over ownership of a tract of land in Oregon valued at $15,000. Marcus Neff, the plaintiff, claimed ownership of the land based on a grant issued to him by the U.S. government in 1866 under the donation law of Oregon. Yeah, so the federal government wants to incentivize settlement of Oregon on the Oregon Trail. So they're issuing these grants basically to incentivize pioneers, whoever, to go and settle the land in Oregon. Neff is one of these people who claims ownership under these grants. Okay, so Neff had hired attorney John H. Mitchell to handle the paperwork for this grant, but a dispute over unpaid legal fees led Mitchell to sue Neff for $300 in 1865. At the time, Neff had moved to California and was not personally informed of the lawsuit, as Mitchell opted to notify him through an unlikely-to-be-seen publication in a newspaper called the Pacific Christian Advocate. Neff's lack of response resulted in a default judgment against him, and his land was auctioned to satisfy the debt. Mitchell himself purchased the land, later transferred it to Sylvester Pennoyer, the defendant, who engaged in timber operations and maintained the property. Of course, upon returning to Oregon in 1874, Neff challenged the legality of the judgment and sale, arguing the Oregon court had lacked jurisdiction over him as he was not properly served. The United States District Court for the District of Oregon ruled in favor of Neff. The Oregon Supreme Court affirmed, and Penoyer appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so to summarize, right, Neff gets this tract of land in Oregon under a grant from the U.S. government, hires an attorney, Mitchell, to help him with this. Of course, Mitchell says he's got these unpaid legal fees, $300. So Mitchell sues, right? He brings an action against Neff for the $300 that he hasn't paid in legal fees. Of course, he notifies Neff of the lawsuit by publishing notice in a newspaper he basically knows Neff is not going to see. Okay, so Neff doesn't see this notice of the lawsuit. Neff probably has no idea he's being sued because he's in California. He's out of state. He doesn't know. So Neff probably has no idea he's even being sued. So he doesn't respond to the lawsuit. So of course the court issues a default judgment against him. Okay, so basically the problem for Mitchell, the lawyer, though, is, well, how's he going to recover this $300? He's got a judgment against Neff, but Neff never even knew the lawsuit existed. So what's he going to do? Like write Neff and be like, hey, I filed this lawsuit against you and got a default judgment. Could you please send me the $300? Like, of course, Neff is going to be like, what? I didn't know about this lawsuit. You can kick rocks. So he's not going to give him $300. He's going to come and dispute it. So kind of it's like a clever, unscrupulous move by Mitchell. He's like, well, I'm not going to tell him about the default judgment, but I know he's got this land in Oregon, this grant. I helped him get it, right? So he's like, I know, I'll go to the court here in Oregon and ask them to compel a sale, basically force a sale of Neff's land so I can recover this debt he owes me, this default judgment I got against him. And of course, the Oregon court grants this. The Oregon court says, sure, you've got this $300 default judgment against him. We'll auction off the land so you can recover that default judgment. Of course, then it's transferred to Penoyer. That's how Penoyer comes into the picture. And then later on, like 8 years later, Neff comes back to Oregon in 1874, and he's like, what happened? Right, so he challenges the legality of the judgment and sale, basically saying Oregon lacked jurisdiction over him. The United States District Court for the District of Oregon says yes, rules in favor of Neff. Oregon Supreme Court affirmed. Penoyer appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so that's what gets us to Penoyer v. Neff, 1877, the United States Supreme Court. The central issue before the Supreme Court in Penoyer v. Neff was whether a state court could exercise jurisdiction and render a valid judgment against a non-resident defendant who was not personally served with process within the state, based solely on the non-resident's ownership of property within the state that was not directly attached or brought under the jurisdiction of the court in the initial proceedings. So the U.S. Supreme Court held that Oregon state courts had no jurisdiction to render a judgment in personam against Neff, a non-resident, because he was neither personally served with process in Oregon, nor did he voluntarily appear in Oregon court, thereby consenting to jurisdiction in Oregon. Furthermore, the court found that the property in Oregon was not properly attached at the start of the litigation, which was necessary to establish in Rem jurisdiction over it. As a result, the judgment obtained against Neff in Oregon and the subsequent sale of his property were deemed invalid. So Neff wins. Okay, basically, to simplify this, remember at the beginning we said it's all about whether there's a sufficient connection between the defendant and the forum state. So our defendant here is Neff, the forum state is Oregon. So the United States Supreme Court is saying, look, for Oregon to adjudicate the rights and liabilities of Neff personally, what we call in personam jurisdiction, to establish in personam jurisdiction, we need a sufficient connection between Neff and the state of Oregon. And here in 1877, the Supreme Court says the only way we can do this is if we can show Neff established physical presence in the state of Oregon, basically in one of three ways. Basically, he lived there, which he did not live there. He was a non-resident. So that leaves us two ways. He's either personally served with process in Oregon, or he consents to jurisdiction in Oregon by voluntarily appearing in Oregon court. He hasn't done either of those. Remember, he was served with this publication in a newspaper. So he's not served while physically present in the state of Oregon, and he does not consent. He never showed up voluntarily and consented to jurisdiction in Oregon. Because he also he wasn't domiciled in the state of Oregon, basically the court says, for these three reasons, he's a non-resident, he did not consent to jurisdiction in Oregon, and he was not served while physically present in the state of Oregon. The state of Oregon did not have in personam jurisdiction over him. They didn't have that. Oregon court did not have the authority to adjudicate his rights and liabilities as a defendant. Basically, we don't have that sufficient connection between the defendant and the forum state. Neff in the state of Oregon. Okay, that's like the in personam jurisdiction side of this. There's also this discussion of in rem jurisdiction. And we don't want to get too confused here. Basically, personal jurisdiction you can break up into two categories. You have in personam jurisdiction and in rem jurisdiction. In personam jurisdiction would be where the plaintiff is seeking to have the court impose a personal obligation on a defendant. Basically, you have usually monetary damages, and you want that defendant to pay you those damages personally, basically like out of their pocket, out of their bank account. You're seeking a judgment against the person. You're asking the court to impose a personal judgment against this person. You want them to impose a personal obligation on the defendant. In rem jurisdiction, you're asking the court to basically impose a judgment on a piece of property. The most classic would be like a quiet title action, right? Where you're going to the court and you're saying, I want you, court, to establish ownership of this piece of property. I want you to establish some ownership interest in this piece of property, right? You're not asking the court to impose a personal obligation on a defendant. You're asking them to establish an interest of ownership in a piece of property. Okay, very different things. Okay, and typically in an in rem action, a court is going to have in rem jurisdiction over property physically situated in the state. So like the state of Texas would have in rem jurisdiction over all the physical property located in the state of Texas. Now, that does not mean that the state of Texas has jurisdiction over any owner of any property that's located in the state of Texas. They can't issue in personam jurisdiction solely based on the fact that someone owns a piece of property that's in Texas. But they have jurisdiction over the property itself. That's in rem jurisdiction. And of course, today we have quasi in rem jurisdiction, type 1 and type 2 quasi in rem jurisdiction. I don't want to get into too much of it here. This would actually probably be more like a type 2 quasi in rem action if it were decided today. But we don't really have that in 1877, so I'm not going to get into too much detail on it. But the point is, the in rem jurisdiction side of this argument fails because it was not attached at the outset of the lawsuit. Basically, the property that was located in Oregon, this land, this parcel of land that was in Oregon, was not attached at the outset of the lawsuit. Remember, initially, Mitchell, the attorney, files the action to recover those unpaid legal fees, right? He only goes after the property after the fact. Remember, we said probably most likely what happens is Mitchell gets that $300 default judgment. Okay, and he realizes, hey, look, I'm never going to get this $300 because if I write to Neff and tell him that I got this default judgment, he's going to be like, what? He's not going to pay me for it, right? He's probably going to show up and challenge the judgment. So he says, instead of actually like letting him know what's happened, I'll just go after this land I know he owns, right? So then he goes after the land after he gets the default judgment. And the court is saying here, because the land was not attached at the outset of the litigation, the Oregon court does not have in rem jurisdiction over it, even though it is located within the physical boundaries of the state of Oregon. You can think of this almost as like a procedural issue, right? It has to be attached at the beginning. The Mitchell, the attorney, didn't attach it at the commencement of the lawsuit. He gets the default judgment first, then he goes after the property. Court says this is the reason the court does not have, the Supreme Court says this is the reason the Oregon State Court does not have in rem jurisdiction over the land in the state of Oregon. Hopefully that makes sense. But that is the key takeaway from Pennoyer v. Neff. The idea here is this is more of an in personam jurisdiction case. You don't get too tripped up on the in rem stuff, because the in rem side of this would be like totally different today with quasi in rem, type 1 and type 2 jurisdiction. In Pennoyer v. Neff, the in rem jurisdiction is more of like a procedural issue. The heart of this analysis is the in personam jurisdiction side of this analysis, where they're saying, look, Oregon doesn't have the authority to adjudicate the rights and liabilities personally of Neff because there's not a sufficient connection. Neff did not consent to jurisdiction in Oregon. Neff was not served while physically present in the state of Oregon, and Neff did not live in Oregon. Therefore, there's not a sufficient connection between Neff and Oregon. Therefore, the Oregon court does not have the authority to adjudicate his rights and liabilities. That's the heart of Pennoyer v. Neff. Today, we call those three requirements the traditional basis of in personam jurisdiction. Basically, what happens if you fast forward to 1945, International Shoe Company v. Washington. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court says, hey, look, if we're thinking about whether there's a sufficient connection between the defendant and the forum state, we don't want to limit this only to physical presence. Okay, we think even if there's not physical presence even if there's not physical presence established by the defendant in the forum state, the defendant could still have a sufficient enough connection to warrant jurisdiction. And they call this concept basically minimum contacts. They say, look, even if none of the traditional bases are satisfied from Pennoyer v. Neff, if minimum contacts exist between the defendant and the forum state, that can be sufficient for the court to have jurisdiction over the defendant. So if we think about this like big picture today, how we apply all of this, the requirements from Pennoyer v. Neff are basically now one way of several ways we can establish jurisdiction over a defendant. Like if I were looking at this on a law school fact pattern or the bar exam, whatever, and I'm being asked to determine whether a court has jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction, I guess specifically in personam jurisdiction over a defendant. Where I'm going to start is Pennoyer v. Neff. I'm going to start with the traditional basis. I'm going to ask, well, number one, was the defendant domiciled in the forum state? Was the defendant served while physically present in the forum state? Did the defendant consent to jurisdiction in the forum state? If any of those are satisfied, okay, court has jurisdiction over the defendant. The difference is, after international shoe, basically with Pennoyer v. Neff, that would be the end of the analysis. But now with international shoe, even if none of the traditional bases are satisfied, the analysis isn't over. We keep going. We go to minimum contacts. We say, well, look, even if none of the traditional bases are satisfied, which are established in Pennoyer v. Neff, we move into our analysis of minimum contacts. The court can still reach out beyond its borders and exercise jurisdiction over an out-of-state defendant if minimum contacts exist between the defendant and the forum state. Okay, and that's what international shoe gives us. So that's the transition from Pennoyer v. Neff to international shoe. And then all of the jurisprudence after international shoe is basically a discussion of, well, what is minimum contacts? What does that require? And all of the case law you read on that is going to be about what is actually sufficient to establish minimum contacts. Okay, but that is the total discussion. That's everything I wanted to cover for Pennoyer v. Neff. This is a United States Supreme Court decision from 1877.